911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone line. There are hostages at 1847 Maple Street. I saw signals in the window, the caller said calmly. Too calmly for someone reporting a crisis. Sir, who is this? The dispatcher asked, fingers already flying across her keyboard to dispatch units. Pizza delivery driver. Sent SWAT within 30 minutes. At least 3 armed suspects inside. The dispatcher paused, confused by the specificity and confidence in the elderly voice. How could you possibly know that? There was a brief silence before the answer came. Because I've been doing this for 40 years. Not delivering pizza, but watching, reading situations, recognizing patterns that most people miss. Frank Morrison was 68 years old. His back slightly hunched from decades of sitting in surveillance vans, his hands arthritic from cold nights in Moscow, Berlin, Havana, but his eyes were still sharp, still catching details that others overlooked, and tonight, those details were screaming danger at a suburban house where he was supposed to deliver a large pepperoni with extra cheese. The company had officially retired him in 2015, a small ceremony, a watch, a pension that barely covered his rent, which is why he was driving for Tony's Pizza Palace, because CIA retirement benefits don't account for inflation or medical bills, and Frank needed the money, but more than that, he needed the purpose, the feeling of still being useful, still being in the game even if the game now involved breadsticks and 2-liter sodas instead of dead drops and encrypted messages. As he sat in his beat-up Honda Civic, engines still running, pizza warming bag in the passenger seat, watching the police units converge on the house he'd just fled from, Frank allowed himself a small smile, because maybe he wasn't the young operative who could run a 6-minute mile anymore. Maybe his fighting days were behind him, but his instincts, those beautiful paranoid instincts that had kept him alive through 3 decades of Cold War and 2 decades of the War on Terror, those were still firing on all cylinders. Still saving lives, just now with marinara sauce instead of classified intel. The house at 1847 Maple Street looked normal from the outside, a typical suburban 2-story with beige siding and a manicured lawn that screamed middle-class American dream. But Frank had learned long ago in Prague that the most dangerous places often wore the mask of mundane normalcy, and this house was practically vibrating with wrong. He'd been delivering pizzas for 3 years now, knew every house on his route. Knew the Johnsons at 1847 always ordered on Fridays, always paid cash, always had their porch light on, but tonight was Tuesday. They'd paid by credit card over the phone, and the porch was dark except for a single window where the curtains moved in a pattern that made Frank's blood run cold. 3 long movements, 3 short, 3 long again. SOS in the universal language of desperation, and then something else. Something more subtle that only someone trained in Cold War communication protocols would recognize. The curtain pulled, halfway, released, pulled a quarter, released, held for 3 seconds, a variation of an old CIA field signal that meant armed captors, multiple, situation critical. Frank had reversed his car slowly, no squealing tires, no sudden movements that might alert whoever was inside, just an old man seemingly having trouble finding the right house. And once he was out of the direct sightline, he'd pulled over and made the call, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system for the first time in years. Sir, we need more information. How can you be certain there are hostages? The dispatcher was asking. Protocol requiring details, confirmation. But Frank didn't have time for protocol. He'd seen what happened when bureaucracy slowed response time, had lost assets in Beirut because someone needed proper forms filed. Listen to me very carefully, Frank said, his voice dropping into the command tone he hadn't used since briefing station chiefs. I'm telling you there are minimum 3 hostages, likely a family, at least 2 adult males holding them based on the tactical positioning I observed through thermal shadows on the curtains. They've been there at least for hours based on the condensation patterns on the windows, and they're nervous because they ordered pizza to make everything look normal but forgot to turn on the porch light, which the Johnsons never forget. Now stop wasting time and send the cavalry. Sarah Johnson felt the rope cutting into her wrists as she sat tied to the kitchen chair, her 2 children, Emma aged 12 and Tyler aged 9, bound beside her while her husband David lay unconscious on the floor, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead where they'd pistol-whipped him for trying to fight back when the 3 men had burst in that afternoon claiming to be utility workers. The leader, a skinny man with prison tattoos crawling up his neck, kept checking his phone, waiting for something, a call maybe, or a text that would tell them what to do next. Because this clearly wasn't going according to plan, they'd been looking for something in David's home office, tearing through files, screaming about Bitcoin wallets and offshore accounts that David swore he knew nothing about. Pizza should be here soon, one of them said. The nervous one who kept scratching at his arms like a junkie needing a fix. Told you we should have just left. This ain't the right house. These ain't the people Marcus said would have the drives. But the leader wasn't listening. He was staring at the window where Sarah had managed to work one hand partially free, just enough to reach the curtain while they were distracted, pulling it in the pattern her grandfather had taught her, the old Marine who'd shown her basic survival signals, never thinking she'd actually need them but insisting she'd learn anyway because you never know. Sweetheart, you never know when knowing might save your life. She'd seen the pizza delivery car pull up, watched the old driver get out, moving differently than usual delivery guys, his head scanning the environment like her grandfather used to do, checking angles, exits, threats, and when he'd stopped and stared at the window, she knew he'd seen it, knew he'd understood, and when he'd reversed instead of approaching, her heart had soared because help was coming. Someone had received her desperate message. The skinny leader was getting agitated now, pacing his gun, waving carelessly. Where's that pizza guy? He should have been here by now. And Sarah wanted to smile but kept her face neutral because she knew that old delivery driver had done something, called someone, set wheels in motion, and now it was just a matter of time. Just a matter of keeping these idiots calm until the cavalry arrived. Frank watched from his car parked behind the Walgreens 2 blocks away as the SWAT vehicles rolled in silent. No sirens, just the subtle rumble of heavy tactical vehicles moving into position. And he felt that old familiar tingle, the electricity that used to flow through safe houses in Berlin before an extraction, through surveillance posts in Tehran before a snatch and grab. Except now he was 68 with bad knees and acid reflux, holding a pizza that was getting cold, while young men with body armor prepared to do what he used to do. His phone rang, not his personal phone but the burner he still carried out of habit. The one only 3 people in the world had the number 4, and when he answered, the voice on the other end made him sit up straighter. Frank, it's Daniels. Heard you called in a situation. You certain about the intel? Deputy Director Daniels, technically Frank's former handler, technically retired himself, but still connected enough to know when certain names popped up in certain reports. Visual confirmation of distress signals, multiple hostiles, civilian hostages, including children, Frank reported, falling back into the clipped efficiency of field reports. Local law enforcement is responding but they don't know what they're walking into. This isn't a random home invasion. They were looking for something specific. There was a pause. Then Daniels asked the question Frank had been dreading. You think it's connected to the Morrison files? The Morrison files, Frank's last official case before retirement, a maze of cryptocurrency, dark web weapons sales, and a ghost named Marcus who'd disappeared with 50 million in Bitcoin and a list of every undercover asset in North America. A case that had gone cold when Frank was forced out. A case that still kept him up at night. The house belongs to David Johnson, software engineer, clean record, but Frank hesitated, pieces clicking together in his mind like tumblers in a lock, but he worked for the same startup that Marcus used as a front. Johnson was the lead developer on their encryption program. If Marcus hid the wallet keys in the code and Johnson has the source files, Daniels cut him off. Stay put, Frank, do not engage. I'm sending a team but they're 20 minutes out. But Frank was already watching the SWAT team preparing to breach, knowing they had no idea they were about to walk into something bigger than a home invasion, something that could get them all killed if the wrong person inside panicked and started shooting. Pizza delivery, Frank shouted, standing at the front door holding the insulated bag high enough to be seen through the peephole, his other hand hidden behind the bag, gripping the Glock 19 he'd kept cleaned and loaded in his glove compartment. For 3 years of pizza runs, because old habits die hard and paranoia had saved his life more times than optimism ever had, he'd slipped past the police perimeter using knowledge of the neighborhood's backyards gained from 3 years of deliveries. Muscle memory from infiltration training taking over as he low-crawled through the gap in the Henderson's fence, and now he stood at the door like just another oblivious delivery guy. Except the SWAT team leader was screaming in his earpiece that he'd grabbed from an unlocked patrol car, ordering him to stand down, to get clear, but Frank knew that sometimes, the best extraction was the one nobody expected. The door opened a crack, chain still on, and the junkie's face appeared, pupils dilated, sweat running down his face. About time, man, where's the food? And Frank smiled the harmless smile of a service worker. Right here, sir, that'll be $23.50, playing the role while his trained eye catalogued everything through the gap. to more men visible, guns tucked in waistbands, the family lined up in kitchen chairs, alive but restrained. "Just slide it through," the junkie said, but Frank shook his head apologetically. "Sorry, sir, company policy, need a signature for orders over $20. Insurance reasons, you understand." And he held up a receipt on a clipboard, the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that even criminals usually accepted without question. The chain came off, the door opened wider, and Frank moved with the fluid economy of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The pizza bag flying into the junkie's face as Frank's foot hooked behind his ankle, sending him backward as the Glock came up. 2 shots sent a mass on the second man who was reaching for his weapon, a pivot and roll that his knees screamed about but completed anyway. Coming up behind the kitchen island as the leader opened fire, bullets shattering the granite countertop that Frank pressed himself behind. "SWAT, freeze." Voices thundered through the front door as the tactical team flooded in. And Frank stayed down, hands visible, letting the young lions do their work while he caught his breath and wondered if his workers' comp would cover pizza delivery drivers who got shot stopping kidnappings. 3 hours later, Frank sat in the back of an ambulance, a paramedic wrapping his scraped knees while Detective Martinez tried to make sense of what had happened. "So you're telling me you're just a pizza delivery driver who happened to recognize obscure hostage signals and then successfully breached a house containing 3 armed suspects?" Frank shrugged, wincing as the movement pulled at his bruised ribs. "I watch a lot of action movies. Figured the pizza thing might work. Got lucky, I guess." Martinez stared at him, clearly not buying it. But before he could press further, a black SUV pulled up and Deputy Director Daniels stepped out, his presence immediately changing the dynamic as local cops suddenly found other places to be. "Frank, you disobeyed a direct order," Daniels said, but there was no heat in it, just the weary acceptance of someone who'd known Frank too long to be surprised. "You could have been killed, could have gotten the hostages killed, could have compromised an ongoing federal investigation into Marcus and the missing Bitcoin." Frank accepted the bottle of water Daniels offered, taking a long drink before responding. "The family's alive, 3 suspects in custody, and I'm betting when you check the nervous one's phone you'll find Marcus has been pulling their strings. Probably promised them a cut of the Bitcoin if they recovered the wallet keys from Johnson's files." Daniels sat on the ambulance bumper beside him, looking older than Frank remembered, the weight of too many secrets etching lines around his eyes. "We've been tracking Marcus for 3 years. Thought the trail was cold until tonight, until you called in a pizza delivery that turned into the break we needed." They sat in comfortable silence. 2 old cold warriors watching the crime scene techs work, the Johnson family giving statements. The media starting to gather, and Frank knew this would be his last delivery, knew Tony would have to find another driver, but somehow that was okay. "You know," Daniels said finally, "the company's been reconsidering its retirement policies. Thinking about bringing back some experienced assets in consulting roles. The pay's better than pizza delivery, and you'd get to keep the gun legally." Frank smiled, the first genuine smile he'd had in 3 years. "Will there be a pension adjustment for inflation?" And Daniels laughed. "I'll see what I can do. But Frank, no more cowboy stuff. We're too old for this." But they both knew that was a lie, that men like them never really got too old. They just got better at hiding their capabilities behind wrinkled faces and slower gaits. As the ambulance pulled away, Sarah Johnson stood with her children, watching the old pizza delivery man who'd saved their lives, and she whispered to her daughter, "Remember his face, Emma. That's what a real hero looks like, not in a cape or uniform, just a regular person who sees something wrong and decides to make it right, even if it costs them everything." Frank Morrison returned to work the next week, not delivering pizzas, but sitting in a small office at Langley, teaching young operatives about field signals, surveillance detection, and how sometimes the best cover was the one nobody would ever suspect, because who pays attention to the old guy delivering pizza? And that invisibility, Frank told them, that dismissible ordinariness, that was the greatest weapon an operative could have, whether they were 25 in Moscow or 68 in suburban America. The mission never really ended, it just changed shape, adapted, evolved, and continued protecting those who would never know how close they'd come to disaster or who had stood between them and the darkness, armed with nothing but experience, instinct, and sometimes a large pepperoni with extra cheese.